Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to leg 7 of the podcast relay. Really looking forward to talking to Shaun West this afternoon. Good afternoon, Shaun. We'll say a little bit more in a second. Just checking I've taken myself off mute and done all the kind of things that I need to do here in the background. And yeah, so we are into leg 7 of If I Knew Then What I Know Now. Really looking forward to the opportunity today to keep the conversation going, having had the chance to speak with Dan Stembridge last week. Dan, with his flying background, handed over to Shaun. Shaun, currently chairman of the COVID-19 Foresight Group. I think I'll double check with that in a moment with you, Shaun. But I think there's a bit of a story as well between you and Dan and sort of how you knew each other, which might be sort of worth going into at some point as we chat today. But we've got, good opportunity to sort of explore If I Knew Then What I Know Now with you today, Shaun, from another world, another performance environment, another context where there's always that need to be learning and reflecting and improving practice, making a difference to your own leadership, that of others. So delighted that you've been able to join us this afternoon, Shaun. And you are in obviously a sporting background. Where are you, Shaun? Where are you joining us from, and how's lockdown been for you so far? I guess from a policing perspective.
Yeah, good afternoon. So I'm here at Sincil Bank, which is the Lincoln City Football Club. So I'm from Lincolnshire. I work Lincolnshire currently, except I have a national role at the moment. And I'll explain the relevance to Lincoln City perhaps towards the end of the podcast. In terms of COVID for me, it's probably not been your typical experience, really, Chris. So I, for the duration of January, February and March, was on my strategic command course. That's the course that you do if you aspire to be a chief officer. And we finished that a matter of days early because clearly a lot of my colleagues and myself were getting called back to forces. And therefore I graduated along with my colleagues early, and then survived all of about 24 hours before I was seconded onto my present role, which is the chairman of the COVID-19 National Foresight Group, which we'll no doubt talk about in due course. From a family point of view, we've been blessed. None of our friends or family have suffered the COVID virus. We've managed to avoid it, but it's been pretty hectic. Certainly when I hear about colleagues working from home, we've not really had the opportunity to do that because the role of public service puts, as indeed it does with all our frontline staff, up close and personal, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of the key workers playing such an important role for us, and I think everyone has kind of had a refreshed view of the value that such workers provide in so many different ways for us over the course of the last few months as well. And I think there's a huge amount of gratitude for that as well, but ongoing gratitude as things, as lockdown eases and other challenges come along, I guess, as well. So it's great. And you say you're in Lincoln, you're at Lincoln City Football Club, just sort of gone into that kind of command qualification that you've just been through as well. Just a little bit of story of what's led you to getting to that point and doing that qualification. Just I guess a bit of a potted career history.
Okay.
Interesting, sure.
Yeah. So I grew up in inner city Nottingham as a young lad with my mum, who effectively was shared between my mum and my dad as single parents who were divorced. So I grew up in quite a deprived area of Nottingham. It was quite tough, and I remember, crikey, age of about 10 or 11, I'd managed to get myself £5 to go and get a haircut, and I was walking down to the barbers for my sort of monthly haircut, and I remember being robbed at knife point, which at the age of 10 was clearly a shock, although not unusual for that area at the time. But I guess that was probably my first experience of that interface with being a victim and seeing it from a member of the community side, and that always left me a long legacy, really, in terms of my wish to support public service and protect those vulnerable, myself being vulnerable really by reason of age. And then you wind that on. So I was born in 72. I was 16 at the time of the Hillsborough disaster, and of course, the tragic circumstances of that are well rehearsed and understood. But that was my first away match. I was a Forest fan, still am, even though I'm sat here at Lincoln City.
Yeah.
But that was my first away match. I remember travelling on the bus to Hillsborough, going in the opposite end to Leppings Lane, and then obviously seeing that unfold. And remember getting back on the bus. Of course, we were all delayed, understandably, because of the vast amount of emergency effort that was going on the pitch and around the ground, and just being left numb, absolutely numb, and indeed feeling helpless. We were all, of course, behind those old style fences for reasons that we now understand. But that sense of not being able to help, and yet being so close to seeing people sadly die, and there's not many days that I don't think about those 96 that died at Hillsborough between the Forest and Liverpool games. So sad events, and that leads me very much into why I became a police officer. And what indeed, I've been very fortunate to go on to be in charge of some significant football matches as a Gold Public Order commander, and indeed wanted to go on to be a firearms commander, CBRN commander, and indeed in charge of some of the roles that local resilience forums, LRFs, play. And we'll no doubt talk about that, because they're very much the Cinderella of emergency services, and do a fantastic job, and have been the lifeblood of all the response and recovery effort around COVID-19. They are fantastic colleagues coming together in quite extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah. I think that's a kind of a fascinating backstory, and you can see the desire to serve, and as you say, protect people unable to, but also take charge of situations where there might be an opportunity to to support people proactively as well, and keep people safe. And would you, when you reflect on if I knew then what I know now, how far back do you go in terms of some of the kind of light bulb moments, or the reflections of actually that was useful knowledge that I gained, or if I'd had that earlier it would have been useful here? Where does the thought take you, Shaun?
I genuinely learn something new every day. It is that that old cliche about every day is a school day, and with 23 and a half years service now in public service, there's not a day that goes by where I don't learn something else off a colleague, off a victim, or indeed the wider community. There are some reference points in particular where I think I wish I'd done things differently, but I think that duty of candour and that ability to take some reflective practice, and indeed in a really transparent, safe way, but not attribute blame, is really important for all of us, because of course things go wrong. That's human nature when you introduce our staff, our colleagues, and under really dynamic circumstances. Of course things will go wrong. I think it's commendable to those that take time out to reflect and take the learning from that, as I say, in a non-attributable blame way, to take the very best of learning and carry that forward, that looking back to look forward.
Yeah. So, Dan and I were talking last week briefly around just culture, and I think that at the beginning of Sidney Decker's book, he recounts an incident in the Sussex Police involving someone who happened to be in the year above me at university. So I was kind of that the person at the heart of that incident was the focus of the challenge of providing restorative justice when everyone wants recriminatory justice in those understandable situations where things haven't gone as desired. And I wonder, is there anything in you that you've learned about yourself that allows you to, you talk about that candor, you talk about that ability to seek the right kind of restoration of justice. Is there anything that you reflect upon about you, stuff that you learned early or stuff that you've learned that helps you keep that mindset of doing the right thing, taking care of the restoration of what's happened to people and putting them in a position to potentially move forward again?
Yeah, there are. I mean, some instances, of course, are sensitive, and although they're natural reference points for me, regrettably, we can't go there. But I think the general principles are you try your very best at that time, as indeed do all my colleagues around me. They're all absolutely committed to public service. When you look at the unprecedented demand that they have day in, day out, at times, at 3 o'clock in the morning when you and I sleep soundly and safely in our beds because of all that they do, then I think there's something around accepting that on occasions we won't get it right. And indeed, the right thing there to do is to make sure we do that reflective practice, hold the mirror up to ourselves, and take the very best of learning from that, which is critical to always continuous improvement, whether that be in my world or indeed participants' worlds today, I'm sure.
Yeah. And do you do that reflective practice equally when things have gone well? So do you get the opportunity to deconstruct, really great moments of service and impact where stuff has followed through? Is that done in the same way with the same quality as well?
I don't think it's done with the same rigor. It's really difficult, isn't it? I think as human nature, we tend to look at what's not worked, what we could do differently, rather than perhaps celebrate success and celebrate all that's gone otherwise so well. So I do try now to make a determined effort to do that and include colleagues to do that, because actually often there's some really good practice that already exists, and therefore why would you reinvent the wheel when actually those colleagues there are doing a fantastic job. But you're right, it is a challenge to adopt that mindset.
Yeah, one of the principles of the just culture is, you assume throughout your culture everyone is starting with a positive intent, having qualified to be in the position to use that positive intent to do as much good as possible. And that's why it's always interesting to me that so therefore following through when that positive intent delivers and their brilliance has an impact, being able to magnify that and have that as the gold standard as well going forward is always interesting as well. And as you say, human nature means that we probably balk against the negative rather than step into the spotlight and kind of go look how brilliant we were. It's not as well rehearsed.
And it plays out in the current role as chair of the C19 National Foresight Group. It is quite extraordinary to be able to do a review or a debrief mid-crisis. Emergency services partners are well practiced at having a significant incident and then doing a debrief after that event. Now, of course, because C19 has such a long tail, response, dual response, and then response and recovery into recovery. That affords us the time, and of course there's been no more acute time to do that, because this is the time where we can continue to save lives, relieve suffering, and support local communities in peril. And therefore what we've been doing is to do some UK-wide reviews in support of the government, in support of partners that work as part of those local resilience forums that are doing all the hard yards and effort over and above the frontline service to make sure that we are doing our best to respond to this emergency and recover from that emergency. And I have the privilege of working with two organisations, the Hydra Foundation and Professor Jonathan Crago, and then Nottingham Trent University, who do the analysis of all of that review for us. And the kind of mindset that Jonathan presents to us is not to ask what isn't working, sorry, what is working, but what you're most proud of. Because when you turn it and put what are you most proud of, people can normally acknowledge that and recognise that and say, I'm really proud of that. But you're right, the questions such as what isn't working and what would you do differently, people naturally latch onto, because of course that's the nature of reflective practice in most of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's making me think as well here about the power of if I knew then what I know now in a much shorter reflection route. I think when I started talking to people about this, the tendency is for people to go back quite deep into history rather than in the last 3 months, in the last 10 days, and that constant, well, actually, if we knew then what we know now, that would have been different, but what might we do today which can now pay service to that new knowledge? I guess you've had a lot of, really quick feedback feed forward loops over the last 3 months and a very steep learning curve, which is probably you're still in the thick of as well. Has there been anything for you through your career that served you well to use this much sort of shorter feed forward feedback loop really effectively over the last few months? Anything you've learned?
I think one, it's the value of doing that review mid-crisis rather than just doing it after the event, because here is the time where you can literally carry it forward into the emergency rather than just taking it into the next emergency of whatever that may be, and then making sure that you share that learning widely with those people that can make a difference and pull those levers and impact therefore positively on public service, particularly those most vulnerable. There's no point me doing a review and then it not seeing the light of day until many years after, when clearly it's important that we carry that learning forward now to save lives, relieve suffering and support those local communities now.
Yeah, and has there been an increasing ease for you to be in that broadcast position where you are trying to help other people get the learning and take on board the learning, and it has to come from you? Yeah, I guess that becomes a spotlight position. And have you learned anything in terms of how to do that with maximum confidence, or feel that you're going to sort of, deliver the message in a way that's going to be really heard and understood and valued?
I think there's something around tying it into values and making sure that you're reaching out for that, starting with the why, in terms of all of those that are involved in that experience, whether that be government departments, partners, volunteers, or the local resilience forums that are doing all of the hard yards on this. They all have the same genuine ambition, which is to save lives, relieve suffering, and support the recovery of our local communities. So I think binding them to that and reminding those colleagues why we seek to do the review and why we seek to take the very best of learning, that's the easy part then, because of course people all have the same overarching strategy and are naturally wedded to it.
Yeah, and along the same theme, I'm interested because there's a lot of people we work with across a lot of different sectors who often find themselves in a room. It's not necessarily broadcasting to people that they're leading, but it's interacting with people who are pretty senior, or there is an air that comes with them. What's been your learning that's allowed you to be in those positions where there's some pretty senior people, some big decision makers, and you're sharing your voice with confidence and authority, even though that feels like maybe a big ask sometimes?
Yeah, I guess it's that ability to speak truth to power.
Okay.
Again, my style is very much a collegiate one. Don't get me wrong, if it's a public order incident where there's less time afforded and we're making some dynamic decisions, then of course that's very much more of a command and control element. But my personal style is one of operating across multidisciplinary teams, a collegiate one, and making sure that it's not the same group think, and therefore having not just diversity within your team, but also diversity of thought. So I've probably only discovered in the latter third of my career around the value of making sure that you afford time to what you might refer to as the renegade archetype. So those colleagues that perhaps are more outspoken, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, making sure as well that you're affording time to those who are slightly perhaps more introverted, quiet leadership. Because, and Dan referenced this last week, he would sit there as a Royal Navy commander in front of a team that would perhaps want to say what they think and expect he would want them to say. But actually, when it comes to how are we going to be innovative, how are we going to protect those most vulnerable, how are we going to support our communities, that public service driver, I'm not the one who's got those ideas. It's my job to facilitate those ideas. And the more diversity of thought that exists within that team, within that room, within that plan of work, and clearly that's required around not just groupthink, but making sure that we're listening to those opposing voices as well. So I suppose, in answer to your question, I carry that through when I find myself in the same situation, to make sure that our voice is heard, but in a really professionally curious and courteous way.
Yeah, yeah, and digging into that truth to power concept a little bit more, because I that's something that is really incredibly valuable, and we as a business certainly try and do that in some of the work that we do through lots of different organizations, but it's not easy.
No.
And I'm wondering for you, was there any teaching or learning or influences that kind of gave you a good sense of actually, okay, that's how you do truth to power, that's how you, or that's why me getting better at it is important to do? Was there anything that helped you?
I've certainly, again, it's a learning experience for me. I've had experiences where, in terms of my colleagues talking to me, in terms of me being the power, so to speak, in that, and making sure that I'm far more amenable and receptive to that, because it's a very brave constable that approaches a senior officer and says, "Boss, I think you've got this wrong, and better still, I've got a better way." So to make sure that you afford space and time to that, and give that colleague the respect that she or he deserves in terms of that kind of approach. And like all things in terms of riding that bike, you slowly learn to adjust your style for the tone and manner, and indeed the person that you're trying to perhaps persuade and ensure that your voice is heard. But I tend to take the view, a bit like the previous answer, I'll tie it back to their values and our values in terms of common objectives and what it is that we've got in common to ensure. And for my area of business, that's normally making sure that we do our very best for the public, save lives, keep them safe, protect those who are most vulnerable. And that's a natural connection if you're working with anyone in public service, whether that be government, civil service, through to partners and those local resilience forums. That's why they exist. That's what I would suggest drives them and causes them to get up in the morning. And that's what they think about perhaps when they're putting their head on the pillow last thing at night.
Yeah, yeah. It just made me think. So it was Olympic Day this week, so there were lots of sort of Olympians sharing their favourite moment on social media, and there was an exchange between Gary Herbert, who coxed Johnny and Greg Searle in 1992, and Matthew Pinson, and I'm pretty sure in their gold medal winning race, Gary as the cox used the phrase, if not you, then who, and if not now, then when. And it kind of makes me think about the truth to power bit as well, actually. Yeah. Checking in, well, if I'm not going to do it, who is going to provide this insight narrative? And if I'm not going to do it now, then, is there a better time, and when might that be? And actually, even though that's a motivational phrase in a lot of sports settings, from a truth to power piece as well, clarifying that role of, well, if it's not me, who is it? But actually, I think it is my role, and stepping into that duty. And it feels like from the very outset, you've got an incredibly strong sense of duty to serve. And I wonder if that was something you noticed even before sort of early childhood experiences and being a victim, or whether that was, that duty to serve and play your part. Has that always been with you? Has that been magnified more? Have you got any reflections on that?
Two bits really. In terms of the truth to power bit and it being your time, I think the other thing is there's so much ambiguity at the moment in the world, particularly with this crisis, that the role of a leader is to instill some certainty amongst all of that ambiguity. That's your opportunity to step up and provide those who work alongside you, those who work on your behalf, and indeed for the members of the public that we serve, to instill some confidence and some certainty amongst all of that. That's why leaders exist, in part, for me. In terms of, sorry, just remind me of the second part.
Duty to serve, and kind of, where that, has that always been with you, even though it may have been magnified by some personal experiences? Is that deep in your character, do you think, and events kind of magnified it further?
Yeah, I think it is. It survived contact growing up in an area where police officers weren't that popular, frankly. I think if I reflect on those times when I was either playing on the sports field or playing with my mates on the River Leen, then police officers weren't particular good company and popular within that peer group. And there's no doubt about it. I made a conscious choice to make sure that I went a particular career path rather than others that were available to me. I think moments like Hillsborough were probably what solidified for me my early years ambition to then go on. I went on to do a law degree. At that time, it was still a case of I really want to go into policing, but I might not be good enough. I might not make it. I might not be physically or medically fit enough when I choose to go for it. But again, having completed my law degree, went the first time, wasn't successful. Joined as a special constable to try and, one, reassure them that I was ready, and two, try before you buy. For those watching, the role of a special constable is absolutely fabulous. They work plenty of hours over and above their day job and contribute a fantastic amount of effort to public service. And then I was then fortunate to be accepted by Lincolnshire at the age of 24, and I've never looked back. It is a fantastic, fantastic career. The challenges for police officers, and indeed all key workers, are quite unprecedented. When I look at my own colleagues working at police constable, sergeant level, etc., they go from job to job to job, whether that be a road traffic collision, then perhaps dealing with a sensitive issue around a child sex exploitation or viewing of indecent images, then through to supporting the nighttime economy and supporting some of the calls for public order that we get. And that drip, and some of the things that our colleagues see leaves a significant impression. And of course, they are humans, not machines. And a little bit like a piece of string, there comes a point at which they may physically or mentally snap. And that takes a particular burden back on themselves, both in the work professional life, but also in the personal one. But they take that back to the families as well, Chris. So the whole well-being piece is really, really important. And I think in recent times, through the leadership of Chief Constable Andy Rhodes, who's the NPCC lead for wellbeing, we've really stepped up and acknowledged the services and the skill set and support that our colleagues need to make sure that they are well supported during these unprecedented times.
Yeah, we'll come on to that, because I think that whole area of sort of acute and chronic trauma and the combination is really fascinating from a personal performance, a leadership point of view, particularly in environments where who you are and your role really matters to you as a person.
Yes.
Yeah, the identity, so that's really fascinating. Just before we get into that, you talked about the leadership role and sort of creating certainty in the times of ambiguity at the moment as well. And I wonder, how much are you finding that useful for yourself, you being in the position to be seeking to create certainty for others? And how does that help you even before it helps other people?
I'm used to living in a fairly ambiguous world, really, both at home. We have 6 children back at home, so they keep us busy. So life is certainly fluid. And then the workplace as well, and the challenges that we have currently, both within the usual demands upon policing and currently upon local resilience forums and COVID. So I guess there is something around wanting to provide certainty for the public and as much as yourself as well. But I sort of accept that I can't always provide the certainty for me, but I'll try and instill it through my leadership to others. And we're normally quite good at coping with that kind of flexibility. I think it's rare to find a public service person that actually isn't used to dealing with ambiguity and that sort of lack of certainty.
Yes, no, really useful. I'm just really interested at the moment in terms of how people are helping themselves through their roles, even though they recognise that part of their role is primarily helping other people as well. And there's that kind of, service to self as well as service to others, I think, which is a key balance. And I'm just thinking, someone I was coaching 18 months ago sort of used the phrase to me that it's hot in the spotlight, so you'd better kind of be ready for it. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about well-being, as you just mentioned, and is there stuff that you know now about well-being that hasn't been in place before that is being particularly useful? Are there attitudes towards well-being that are particularly helpful right now for you in guiding support that's being provided, or sort of, just leadership style even?
Yeah, I think it's probably two parts really. First and foremost, it starts with me, because I need to ensure that my well-being is intact and that I'm looking after myself, to be then responsible for my team, and indeed then delivering that through leadership to public service. So more than ever, I keep myself in check. There's things like, where do you build your capacity from? Because it can be quite wearing. So I recognise now that there's certain things that I enjoy, and that actually in my moments of reflection or my sort of dark hour, that I need to, one, identify that dark hour, and two, support network around you, whether that be friends, family. Again, it's part of that opening your Johari window and sharing as much as you sensibly can, because again, in our roles, there's some things that you can't share. You can only talk about the principles of that event that's occurring. But to make sure that I do those things that I enjoy in that time that I get to take off. So for me, I enjoy my sports. I try to indulge upon those as much as I can. I enjoy just sitting in front of the TV and watching something that, frankly, is not mind consuming and just easy going. And then I do quite a lot with our mini police. I'm one of the national leads for mini police, so I enjoy a lot from youth engagement. So where I have time, that's one of the ways that I'll build capacity in me. That's all then about making sure that I'm in the best possible position then to look after the well-being of others. And you're right, in terms of, first and foremost, an investment in time, both in peacetime, but also when those staff need you. It's really important that staff have that relationship with you, so that they can reach out. A broad array of services now that weren't previously employed within emergency services, ranging from making sure that our staff associations are there to give fantastic support. We're blessed with the Police Federation. They do a superb job locally, regionally and nationally. Then even looking at things like neurolinguistic programming and trauma, TPIMs, TRIM, in terms of managing all of that in support of those colleagues that are just facing unprecedented times, and recognising that goes beyond those staff as well, to their families as well, because of the legacy that leaves with their families.
Yes, yeah. One of the team yesterday was having a conversation with a business around making, some of our mental health content available to the families of the people who work for the business, and not just the business. And that kind of extended model of support, I think, is one that's going to become more and more the norm. And I'm interested, you talk about the capacity piece, and certainly for folks listening who are familiar with the performance room, there's a lot we do around capacity, getting fit for purpose. Do you feel ready to do what you need to do? There's some of the recent stuff we've put on about put your own oxygen mask on first as a leader before you help others, and some really practical stuff around that. But I'm also interested in all of that in the context of now, but against that previous description you gave, where people are regularly exposed to traumatic things anyway, even before we went into COVID. You've got people who are kind of potentially in acute or chronic trauma, then going into another period of high stress, uncertainty on top of that as well. And I just wonder if you've had any learnings or reflections on, going to another level of stress when people are already in a pretty, stressful environment anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the C19 COVID lens, if that's the additional pressure you're referring to, definitely puts a different complexion on this, because people will have naturally already had their own pressures to bear and their own demands upon them. And then C19 has undoubtedly a really, really long tail. We are far from being out of the woods. Of course, there's been some relaxation as we tip from response into recovery. But when you look at, and this is common to all people, not necessarily emergency services, but when you look at the mental health consequences of an enduring lockdown, loneliness, isolation. For some, we've seen some addiction rise around online gambling because they're being restricted to being within the home place. And then the impact around furlough, unemployment, denial of academic justice. I mean, one of my children, 18, and was expecting to do A levels to then go into university. It's a very, very different landscape. So you're right, it adds an additional burden, and that has to be part of the recovery process, because if that's not addressed, then that will leave a significant impact for generations well beyond yours and mine.
Yeah. I wrote something a little while ago going into sort of lockdown. I think it's really safe to just assume that everyone is stressed, and whatever they're showing, if we assume that there is a stress, how do we then start looking out for people to one, help manage that, but two, reduce some of that and move back to a position of sort of non-stress or coping. And it just makes me think about that environments of the emergency services, and the mental health support that is provided. Is it assumed from the outset that we are, asking people to live in an unreasonable environment where actually there is challenge all the time, and people are put in situations which are stressful, and there's those sort of mini cuts that kind of build up over time. Has that changed in terms of the recognition of that over time, and has support been changing as a function of that?
Yeah, I think we all have our own threshold, we all have our own coping mechanisms, and I think we've all looked at ourselves in terms of how we might deal with the restart and what is a new norm to all intents and purposes. I think the other thing is, though, so you're right, that services have changed. People like NHS England, local mental health trusts have been really agile in terms of how they repurpose and pivot to deal with that new world. And there are so many fantastic voluntary organisations out there. Help is just a telephone call away, or a digital teleconference now. But I think the other thing is just applying that positive mindset that you were talking to earlier on in terms of what should we celebrate, what should we be most proud of. There've been a lot of positive opportunities emerging from this. When you look at some of the kindness and the charity that's been applied by so many communities, I can't help but think the power of our communities has to be the way forward. That cohesion of communities coming together, embracing this, and making sure that restart and recovery is a really positive opportunity, and that we look after ourselves. And kindness is often underrated, but I think this is one of those opportunities where we do need to come together and show that kindness and charity that's within us all.
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting. Mindset, expectations are shifting, and the recognition of proactive support rather than waiting for things to break. There's just such a good move in the right direction, and that's can only be really helpful when we're helping people get better at seeking support. We're helping them improve it rather than sort of helping them get better at using it once it's perhaps gone past the threshold. And I wonder in the sort of, because it's a very wide-ranging working group that you've got within the COVID-19 force. Have you been able to get any new insights or learning as a function of some of the different groups that you're working with, people that you're working with, expertise that you're having really close working relationships with?
Yeah, indeed, it's a multidiscipline team. So we're blessed with, so we are an independent group,
right?
But we have the participation of likes of Cabinet Office, Ministry for Housing, Communities, Local Government, Public Health England, NHS England, Department of Health and Social Care, supporting the local resilience forums, of which there are 38 across the country. And that gives a really different insight. And it really is to their credit, government included, that they're holding the mirror up to themselves and want to embrace that duty of candour, so that we can make sure that we keep that proverbial sword sharp and improve the service and improve the response and dual recovery, so that we can get ahead of this and then start to emerge through that restart and recovery.
Yeah, yeah, and, you know, you mentioned the housing service there, and I think that's fascinating from my knowledge of the work that was done there around creating psychologically informed environments where everyone who is involved is able to be party to decision making that has got the psychology of people at the heart of it, rather
Yes.
than this process and sort of, you know, very procedural decision making. Are we psychologically informed in what we understand about the individuals, their psychology, their mental health, and have we got a common language around that stuff? And, you know, it's great to know that organizations that have got that kind of bias are also being involved with other organizations that have got a, you know, that bring a different strength to that as well. And I think psychologically informed environments become more and more powerful for all of us as we go forward. I don't know if that's come up in any of the conversations, but it, you know, feels like a very pertinent area for me.
Yeah, it is. And you're right, very much a multidiscipline team, spectrum of thought, and that keeps them really sharp to make sure that that continuous improvement that's so critical and key here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And last thing for you, I'm interested just in terms of your reflections, having recently done that qualification and managed to graduate just before lockdown. Was there anything that you reflect back on? If I knew then what I know now, was there anything earlier in your career that actually was really useful learning, that going into that most recent qualification actually gave you great perspective, gave you great appreciation, gave you great understanding of the leadership opportunity that you further opened up for yourself?
I think there's something around making every second count in terms of your experience. I've been privileged to have some really unique experiences over 23 and a half years working here at Lincolnshire Police within the local resilience forum, seconded to fire and rescue and the county council, some secondments internationally, and then latterly here at the National Foresight Group. There's something around make your opportunities, enjoy those, every second counts, because there really is no replacement for that experience. In my dark hours, I do draw back on two routes really. One is that peer support around, but most importantly, that learnt experience, the reflections of what I'm proud of, and indeed what I'm not so proud of in terms of those areas where you could have done something differently, could have made improvements, and to constantly draw down on that. I think my biggest takeaway from one of the biggest takeaways from the command course was just the power of relationships, whether that be the power of your teams and colleagues, the power of communities coming together, and the power of partners, as in partnerships, and to make sure that in peacetime, you make that investment so that when you're in an emergency like this, you can draw down on those experiences, hit the ground running, and then do what we're paid to do, which is deliver a public service that is worthy of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, no, really, really strong. Again, makes me really sort of reflect on a couple of the things that you said. That's, you know, making every second count could sound exhausting, which is why the taking care of yourself stuff on the other side of it is so important as well, to balance those things as well. And that having the capacity bit, you know, you've really clearly articulated that you've got to fill the well in order to be able to draw on it. And that feels, you know, like you've got a great recipe worked out for yourself there.
It has its payoff, and you know, if we were talking regrets, then you know, I regret missing some family moments. Your youngest is 7 today, and I know you're going to go and celebrate a birthday weekend, and you know, many congratulations. I think when I look back at some of the birthdays, the sports days, the nativities that I've missed, that's something that I would seek to change in future. And indeed, now I'm more minded as a leader. That ability to be able to say to one of your team, go, whether that be in uniform or not, it does not matter. Those are also crucial matters, and every second counts to make sure that you have that balance of professional life with your family life, because those two parts really do matter. And I think on reflection, I've not always got that right. And that's in my must try harder box.
Yeah, no, sounds again, you know, very humble reflections as well, because certainly giving yourself a big challenge of moments to miss with six in the family as well. So I think, you know, it's kind of a high bar as well. But no, really, really humble. And I love that reflection on, you know, both looking back to the command learning, the human relationships, the importance of the ongoing relationships here for you, the truth to power piece, that, you know, there's so much here which is coming through, which is person to person, people to people, taking care, using positions, you know, in a way that is always supporting as well. And, you know, what, regardless of the uniform or the title, that desire to kind of connect with other people and make a positive difference as a function of the relationship, that's coming through kind of loud and clear and everything. And I get, you know, it sounds like there's a lot of people who are, you know, probably in a privileged position to be led by you, as well as you knowing the privilege and responsibility you have of leading them, and that you know, that blends for a very powerful working environment as well. So thank you for your candor. You said before that you know, you were gonna, you enjoyed using candor and some self candor there as well. Is sort of great. So hugely appreciated. Lots of really kind of great reflections. And as we kind of draw to the end of today, I'll give you a couple of last bits. Any final thoughts, and then who are you handing over to in terms of the baton as we move into leg 8 next week of the podcast relay?
Yeah, indeed. I think my final thoughts are, I've been very candid around regrets. I think if you turn that to a positive, making sure that you make the very best of experiences with your team. I've not always got it right, and it's brave PCs and sergeants and inspectors and above that have told you not got it right. So that ability to listen to your team, but be in a position where you are approachable to genuinely receive and indeed respond to that, and then the family bit as well, and that professional curiosity, to continuously be professionally curious, and at all costs make sure that we are absolutely reflective, and hold that duty of candor, because it's all too easy for things to have a blind eye, stick your head in the sand. The balance and the need to be more candid rises the more closer you get to the risk to life and people suffering. So for me, that's just one of those absolute musts, that it must be done. In terms of where next, so there is a reason why I'm sitting at Lincoln City as a Forest fan, because otherwise that would be somewhat ironic. We're fortunate here to have a chief executive called Liam Scully. Liam's been here now for several years, having come from Doncaster. Liam is undoubtedly a community-minded leader. He has, as chief executives do, all sorts of leadership challenges, both on the pitch and off the pitch. And it's a difficult balance, I feel, for chief executives. And of course, touched by COVID-19 now, in terms of the premature end to the season, certainly for this league anyway. So Liam will be available, and I know is really keen to speak with you and your participants next Friday around about 12:15.
Fantastic. No, great. That'll be fascinating to kind of get an insight in that role. I think there's so much we see within the chief executive football role, which is all about kind of what's going on the pitch and around the playing, but actually there's that much wider responsibility in and around the club and the community and everything that goes with it. So that's going to be fascinating to get that insight. So thank you. That's a great handover, and very much enjoy that. Superb, Shaun. Really enjoyed the conversation. Some great insights for people to reflect on. And I'm sure some stuff going through people's heads, you know, about, okay, how well am I doing on this stuff, and how well am I taking care of me, and sort of stepping into that leadership role really myself as well. So thank you for stimulating that thought. We will be obviously sending through to you as well information so you can get on the performance room and take advantage of that, the Believe performance stuff and mental health. So anything that we can do that sort of brings more value to that, as a big thank you for being part of this, we'll be part of that. But yeah, please keep doing the work that you're doing, which is keeping us all safe, and more power to that, and stay safe with that as well. And to everyone who was here today, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and stay safe over the weekend. I'm going to go and do the 7th birthday thing, so I will very much look forward to that. So we will finish there, and thank you very much, everyone. See you next time. Thanks again, Shaun.
Thank you, Chris. Safe weekend, everyone. Thank you for having me.